He was the Desert Fox, a commander whose image adorned posters, whose tactics reshaped modern armored warfare, and whose charisma made him a favorite in the corridors of power. Yet that very man, hailed as a national hero and wrapped in the regime's own mythology, would find himself isolated from the leadership he once served, and in the end, forced into a death that the state presented as an honorable sacrifice. The twist was not that Rommel failed as a general, it was that the regime that cultivated his legend ultimately betrayed him. Erwin Rommel's story began in the trenches of the First World War. Born in 1891 in Württemberg, he made his first name as a young officer who moved quickly through the brutal apprenticeship of modern war. Those early experiences, small unit leadership under fire, improvisation when orders failed, a talent for reading terrain and human nature, stayed with him. They became the foundations of a military mind that would later prize boldness and initiative above rigid doctrine. Between the wars, Rommel's path diverged from many of his peers. He embraced emerging ideas about mobile warfare, volunteered for demanding postings, and drew attention as both an instructor and a tactician. By the late 1930s, when Germany reharnessed its armed forces, Rommel's reputation was on the rise. He was not merely competent, he had the photographer's gift, a weathered face, a clear gaze, and an aura of action that the new propaganda apparatus could shape into a symbol. Adolf Hitler took notice. For a period, Rommel was among the officers who enjoyed the Führer's favor, summoned to conferences and rewarded with promotions. To the public, cropped portraits and praise in newspapers turned him into an emblem of a victorious, modern Germany. That ascent was swift and dramatic, culminating in the Lightning Campaign of 1940 through France and the Low Countries. Rommel, commanding a panzer division, demonstrated the aggressive, decentralized tactics, fast advances, flexible thrusts, and the exploitation of gaps that would be called blitzkrieg. Armored columns broke through, paratroopers seized bridges, and the campaign's speed stunned observers. For Rommel, these victories were both professional triumphs and the source of a growing celebrity. Back home, the propaganda ministry elevated him, crafting a narrative of the brilliant field marshal who embodied the Wehrmacht's prowess. Yet celebrity and tactical success masked deeper strategic realities. The war had opened multiple fronts, and the Wehrmacht's victories consumed men and material faster than industry could replace them. From late 1941, the Nazi state's ideological and logistical decisions, most notably the diversion of resources to ideological obsessions in the East and campaigns of extermination, began to shape the battlefield in ways no single commander could control. The advanced Germans stalled at Moscow, then ground deeper into the quagmire of the Soviet Union. At Stalingrad in the winter of 1942-1943, the Wehrmacht suffered a catastrophe that reshaped the war's possibilities. For Rommel, the collapse of Germany's strategic position was not an abstract statistic. It was a tangible, growing reality that forced him to confront the limits of frontline valor. In the deserts of North Africa, where he was sent in early 1941, Rommel found an arena that magnified both his genius and his vulnerability. Against him stood not only British and but also the realities of supply lines stretching across the Mediterranean, weather that chewed up vehicles and men, and the mounting superiority of Allied air and naval forces. His early audacity, rapid flanking maneuvers, bold advances into enemy rear areas, and a knack for improvisation produced spectacular victories and a reputation that transcended borders. British commanders spoke of his skill. Soldiers on both sides respected the professional quality of his leadership. But North Africa also exposed the structural problems Germany faced. Logistics mattered as much as tactical daring. Rommel's campaigns demanded fuel, spare parts, and secure lines from European ports. Allied control of the sea, improvements in interdiction, and the growing air superiority over the Mediterranean choked his supply routes. Year by year, the balance shifted. A commander who had once ridden the tide of German operational momentum found himself fighting a rearguard against attrition. His letters and reports showed frustration with the politics of supply. Despite requests and warnings, reinforcements and materiel did not arrive at the scale the theater required. Beyond the hardware, Rommel's relationship with the regime also began to fray in subtler ways. He had been celebrated in home front pages, but visibility came with obligations. The propaganda machine expected its heroes to perform in ways that served the state's myth-making. Rommel carefully navigated that public role while privately remained a professional soldier. At times, he praised the troops and their resilience. At others, he offered blunt assessments that did not suit the myth. More important, as reports from occupied territories and from the Eastern Front reached him, Rommel could not ignore the regime's criminality. The the systematic persecution and mass murder enacted by the SS and other agencies were not remote abstractions. They were facts of policy with moral and practical consequences. Those facts fed a growing dissonance between Rommel's sense of duty to Germany and his growing unease about the political leadership's direction. By mid-1942 and into 1943, the Desert Campaign reached its limits. El Alamein marked a turning point. The British, under a reorganized command and benefiting from improved logistics and intelligence, halted and then pushed back Axis forces. Rommel's skill could not translate into an irreversible victory when supplies ran out and the Allies controlled the sea lanes.
In Tunisia, the final Axis force in North Africa was trapped and overwhelmed. Rommel, recalled to Europe, encountered a Germany that looked different from the one that had cheered him in earlier years. The declines on the Eastern Front and the loss of North Africa signaled strategic failure at a scale that tactical audacity could not remedy. It is here that the narrative of Rommel takes a new and more complex turn. No longer just the brilliant commander who dazzled the public, he became a general wrestling with the morality and consequences of continued war. He was not a politician. His language remained the blunt idiom of a soldier. Yet his assessments grew sharper, often dismissive of the fantasies that sustained Hitler's decision-making. He saw the shrinking material base of the Reich, the desertion of realistic strategy in favor of ideological stubbornness, and the toll these choices took on the German people and the army. Those who knew him later recalled a man who increasingly spoke of the necessity of limiting further devastation. His son, Manfred Rommel, would later insist that his father was not an ideologue, that Erwin loved his country but was not a believer in the Nazi program. Contemporary voices close to Rommel described a professional officer alarmed by the consequences of Hitler's obstinacy. These recollections provide a human anchor to what might otherwise be a technical debate about campaigns and supply charts. They tell of a man who began to contemplate alternatives that once would have seemed unthinkable. When Rommel was reassigned to the Western Theater in 1943, the task before him was stark. The Allies, having succeeded in North Africa and Sicily, were preparing for a cross-channel invasion that would open a decisive Western front. The German High Command responded by ordering a program of coastal fortification, an organized, industrialized system to delay and blunt any amphibious assault. Rommel was given a central role in this effort, partly because of his reputation and partly because the leadership wanted someone who could impose order and urgency on a defense that had been neglected for months. The transformation he undertook along the French coast was systematic and practical. Rommel insisted on distributing anti-tank obstacles, strengthening beach exits, and placing artillery in positions that would interdict landing zones. He emphasized local defense and the initiative of junior officers. He wanted to make every mile of coast into a defended obstacle that would force the Allies to pay dearly for each landing. Where others were content to rely on rigid centralized control, Rommel spoke the language of decentralized resistance, small units striking at vulnerability, turning the terrain into an ally. He inspected beaches, walked dunes, and demanded to see what his engineering corps proposed. To soldiers under his authority, he seemed like the old Rhine River warrior, asking how best to buy time and inflict maximum cost. This work, however, took place under a political roof full of cracks. There were disagreements within the German High Command about the strategic allocation of forces. Some senior leaders favored a defense-in-depth strategy, reserving mobile divisions to counterattack after Allied landings. Others, including Hitler, preferred to hold the front lines and forbid tactical withdrawals. Rommel's proposals sometimes clashed with those of the OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, and field marshals who saw different operational priorities. The tension was not merely military, it became a moral and practical question about how much the German state would allow its commanders to choose realism over ideology. Complicating the situation was an Allied deception operation of striking artistry. Operation Fortitude, an elaborate campaign of false information, dummy armies, double agents, and feints, sought to convince German command that Allied landings would come at the Pas de Calais rather than Normandy. Allied intelligence fed patently plausible lies to German planners. Inflatable tanks and wooden aircraft sat where the enemy expected a vast armada. Rommel and others were misled, not simply by military subterfuge, but by a fog of genuine uncertainty. The deception worked because the Germans had multiple plausible hypotheses about Allied objectives. To some decision-makers in Berlin and elsewhere, Pas de Calais seemed the logical choice. Rommel, ever practical, distrusted over-reliance on central predictions. He wanted defenses in a broad array of likely landing sectors, and he opposed hoarding mobile reserves far inland where they could be delayed by Allied air power. His insistence on practical measures, anti-tank hedgehogs on beaches, mines, hardened gun emplacements, reflected both his doctrinal preferences and his lack of faith in the Führer's strategic infallibility. He argued to colleagues that raw force and quick counterattack would be less effective than a widespread, resolute defense that exploited local conditions. To many, this was not doctrinaire dissent, but professional candor. Rommel simply applied the lessons of mobile warfare to the task of static defense. In late 1943 and early 1944, Rommel toured the Atlantic littoral and addressed engineer units, regiment commanders, and coastal defenders. He spoke bluntly to officers who believed victory was merely a matter of will. In private correspondence and reports, he warned of shortages and the impossibility of repeating the operational successes he had enjoyed under more favorable circumstances. He urged improvements in fortifications and greater freedom for local commanders to act.
His assessments, however, reached an ear-splitting counterpoint. Hitler's inner circle resisted rehearsing the possibility of defeat or negotiation, and the propaganda apparatus remained focused on maintaining morale and the myth of eventual victory. As Rommel intensified his preparations, he also grew more vocal about the political stakes. He did not become a public dissident, that was not his mode. Instead, in memos and private conversations, he framed defeat as a catastrophe not just for soldiers, but for German society itself. He believed, with increasing urgency, that a negotiated settlement might spare both the military and civilian population from ruin. That belief put him at odds with a regime unwilling to contemplate compromise. Once more, the intersection between military realism and political ideology produced conflict. Rommel's suggestions were read by some in Berlin as defeatist and by others as sober counsel. The months leading up to the summer of 1944 were a period of accumulation. Rommel fortified beaches and recorded warnings. He watched as Allied aircraft swarmed the skies, as convoys kept arriving in growing numbers, and as the intelligence picture painted an ominous picture. When news filtered in about the Allied concentration of ships and supplies in southern England, Rommel grew increasingly convinced that a cross-channel operation was near. His letters and conversations with peers and subordinates took on an urgent tone. Prepare every beach, expect an amphibious assault, assume the enemy would use overwhelming air support. He pushed for quick, decisive defensive measures because he knew that once the Allies had established a lodgment on the coast, the strategic game, one Germany was already losing on multiple fronts, would be nearly unwinnable. The man who had once moved through deserts with audacity now walked the dunes of northern France with a sense of constrained dread. In private, he told friends and family that the war had reached a point where professional competence could no longer mask catastrophic political decisions. Yet in public, when photographed speaking to soldiers, when attending parades, he remained the model field marshal, composed, authoritative, the face of a military that still pretended to hold the line. That dissonance between private urgency and public polish deepened the irony of his later fate. After the initial phase of defensive work, Rommel was due to return to Berlin and to consult with the High Command. He sought authority to reposition forces and to grant initiative to capable subordinates. The debates in headquarters were bitter and at times petty. Inter-service rivalries, personal rivalries, and the cult of personality surrounding Hitler complicated sound military deliberation. To those who watched his career closely, Rommel's role in the West began to feel like a last great attempt to translate fieldcraft into a strategy that might avert national catastrophe.
Yet, even as he worked, forces beyond his control, industrial shortages, Allied air supremacy, and an ideological leadership that equated surrender with treason, tightened the noose. This is where part one of Rommel's arc reaches a hinge. The Desert Fox had risen from the trenches to become a symbol and a strategist, admired and mythologized. He had twice demonstrated tactical brilliance in the armored breakthroughs of 1940 and the desert maneuvers of 1941-1942, and he had navigated the dangerous intersection of fame and loyalty. But the evidence of strategic collapse and moral horror had also changed him. He had moved from adulation to skepticism, from practical competence to a sense that larger political forces were determining outcomes no soldier could fix. The story then turns on a crucial question.
Could a single commander, even one with Rommel's skill and reputation, bend the arc of a regime that had invested its identity in perpetual victory and ideological purity? He returned to the heart of the conflict, convinced that the Western Front must be defended with realism and that the cost of failure would be immeasurable. Yet his calls for pragmatic measures and for protecting Germany from complete ruin set him on a collision course with political leaders committed to a different vision. As Rommel prepared the coast, he did not yet know how sharply the state would react to his realism, nor how isolated he would become from the very apparatus that had once celebrated him. The coming months would test not only his military judgment, but the limits of loyalty under a regime that conflated dissent with treachery. What followed would be a sequence of events, injury, conspiracy, reprisal, that would transform the celebrated icon into a tragic figure caught between duty and conscience. The betrayal at the heart of the story is not an abrupt act, but a series of choices, decisions in Berlin, officers' responses, and the regime's willingness to sacrifice its own symbols for political survival. In the weeks before the expected invasion, Rommel oscillated between meticulous preparation and an almost private despair. He had asked for reserves and for the authority to move them where needed. He had reinforced beaches and ordered obstacles in place, and he had lectured commanders on the need for decisive local action. All these measures were practical, tactical, and ultimately defensive. Yet they could not alter the bigger truth. Germany was strained on multiple fronts, and its political leadership increasingly seemed incapable of adjusting course. Rommel's role in these final preparations placed him in a unique and precarious position. The regime's poster general, now positioned at the furthest edge of the Reich, staring at a storm gathering in the Channel. He remained, at this point, an officer performing his duty. He also became an uneasy conscience for a state that had once embraced him.
That paradox of a man both celebrated and uncomfortable with what his country had become would be the engine of the story that unfolded next. When the storm hit the Channel in June 1944, Rommel's preparations met both the ingenuity of Allied deception and the blunt force of amphibious assault. Operation Fortitude had sown false confidence in sections of the German High Command. Dummy tanks, planted radio traffic, and carefully managed leaks persuaded many in Berlin that the main invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais. Rommel, who distrusted centralized predictions, had argued that defenses must be broadly distributed. He pushed for fortifications along all likely beaches. He demanded mines, hedgehogs, and artillery emplacements be sited where men would have to fight for every yard. Yet the intelligence fog and Hitler's fixation on a single, decisive location meant that mobile reserves were withheld inland and that some senior commanders expected the Allies to strike elsewhere. By the morning of June 6th, Rommel was not at the immediate center of decision-making in Normandy. Historians differ about the precise reasons for his absence. Some point to a previously scheduled return to Germany to visit family and consult on matters of health. Others note his need to brief superiors in Berlin. What is clear is that the man who had walked beaches and ordered concrete obstacles into place that spring was not present at the most crucial hour to make the real-time, on-the-spot calls his doctrine had insisted upon. The landings went ahead under an overwhelming Allied air and naval umbrella. Beaches that had been improved did not remain impregnable once the Allies secured footholds and poured men and materiel ashore. The initial confusion among German commanders, compounded by conflicting orders and Hitler's insistence on restraint, cost precious hours. Rommel's decentralized doctrine, give local commanders the authority to act quickly, would have favored faster counterattacks. Instead, senior commanders hesitated. The outcome was not a single neat catastrophe attributable to one absence. It was the product of a brittle strategic posture, stretched logistics, and a command culture that punished initiative unless it matched the Führer's will. In the days after Normandy, as Allied supply lines widened and armored divisions flowed onto French soil, Rommel's worst strategic fears hardened. A war already lost on other fronts would now be decided on the Western Front as well. Back in the limelight and out of it, this oscillation defined much of Rommel's final months. He was simultaneously the Reich's poster marshal and a professional who had begun to speak plainly about national peril. In private memos and conversations, he urged negotiation as a way to spare Germany utter ruin. To some colleagues, this sounded like cynicism turned political. To others, it was the blunt counsel of an officer for whom continuing the struggle seemed only to multiply death and disaster.
Manfred Rommel, his son, later remembered a father who loved his country, but who was not a Nazi. That personal recollection supplies an emotional anchor. the image of an officer worried about the fate of soldiers and civilians, not an ideologue defending brutal policies. Yet personal unease and public counsel were not the same thing as active opposition. Rommel rarely crossed into explicit political conspiracy. He did not publish denunciations of the regime. He accepted honors and maintained a visible role within the Wehrmacht's leadership. That paradox is central to any fair account. A man who argued for pragmatic choices while remaining embedded within a regime that refused compromise. And when conspirators inside the German officer corps began to plot Hitler's removal, some among them considered Rommel a potential figurehead, or at minimum a sympathetic senior officer whose endorsement might lend legitimacy to any post-coup government. Whether Rommel ever gave his clear consent remains contested. Some witnesses later said he was approached and expressed tacit sympathy, while others insist he remained aloof from specific coup plans. Historians continue to debate the quality and weight of the evidence. The violence of politics made an abrupt intervention on July 17, 1944. Rommel's staff car was struck in a sudden attack. Accounts differ on whether the vehicle was hit by strafing aircraft while moving through Normandy countryside or whether it struck a landmine. What is not in doubt is that the result left Rommel gravely wounded. He suffered severe skull fractures and other injuries that removed him physically from the center of command at a forbidding hour. The injury could not have come at a worse time for a man trying to steer a pragmatic course. Weeks later, on July 20th, a bomb placed by Klaus von Stauffenberg exploded at Hitler's Wolfschanze headquarters in East Prussia, an assassination attempt that failed but launched a ferocious purge across the Reich. The July 20 plot and its catastrophic failure altered everything. The regime reacted with ruthless speed. Thousands were arrested, tortured, and executed. Old networks of professional military friendship became a web of suspicion. In the purge's aftermath, investigators probed the connections of suspected conspirators. Rommel's name surfaced not because the evidence was clean and incontrovertible, but because of his recent cautions about the war, his private conversations with disaffected officers, and his occasional contacts with men who had plotted against the Führer. Some conspirators had hoped Rommel would endorse a post-Hitler government. Other accounts suggest they merely assumed he would respond to the new reality once Hitler was gone. That ambiguity between suspicion, hope, and complicity left Rommel horribly exposed. Unable to speak publicly in his own defense without risking immediate arrest or worse, he became the subject of interrogation and rumor.
Senior officers, operating under direct orders from Berlin's inner circle, gathered their evidence. What reached Rommel while he convalesced was not a fair judicial process, but an ultimatum. Be tried as a traitor before the People's Court under Roland Freisler, an outcome likely to mean execution and the endangerment of his family and friends, or accept a different option offered by emissaries representing Hitler's will. The offer was brutal and precise. Take poison, die quietly, and your family would be spared public disgrace. State honors would be preserved. Your funeral would be presented as a ceremony for a loyal soldier. On October 14, 1944, Rommel accepted that grim choice. The exact dynamics of how he reached this decision are complicated by incomplete records, the haze of secrecy surrounding the regime's purges, and the personal ordeal of a man already weakened by injury. Some witnesses maintain that the choice was presented with a veneer of compassion, protect the family, spare the nation the spectacle of a show trial, while others see it as a thinly disguised act of political murder, to make an inconvenient figure die in a way that secured a tidy, propagandistic narrative. It remains historically accurate to say that Rommel was given the option to commit suicide, and that for reasons partly practical and partly personal, he accepted. The cyanide he ingested killed him on October 14th. The Reich staged a state funeral, complete with the trappings of honor, martial music, military decoration, and official rhetoric that framed his death as the demise of a loyal servant. The propaganda machine that had earlier elevated Rommel now rewove his final image. Photographs and newsreels presented the Wehrmacht's fallen hero, and the party apparatus used the occasion to shore up morale. The irony was bitter. A man who had been made into a symbol in German martial virtue had been quietly removed by the very leadership that once celebrated him. Personal testimonies from his family illuminate the human cost. Manfred Rommel recalled the humiliation and the protective calculus that had shaped his father's last days. Lucy Rommel, his wife, avoided public condemnation in an era when association with an accused traitor could be fatal. Later recollections highlight a desperate bid to preserve family safety amid an atmosphere of terror. These memories are powerful precisely because they are intimate, yet like all family testimony in such a fraught historical field, they carry both emotional truth and the limits of individual perspective. They tell us how the regime's choices reverberated through personal lives, how political purges ripple beyond the courtrooms and battlefields into kitchens and bedrooms. After the war, Rommel's death became a cornerstone of contested memory.
In Germany and abroad, a narrative emerged that painted him as the clean soldier of the Wehrmacht, an apolitical professional caught between duty and conscience, ultimately punished by a criminal regime. That interpretation helped shape immediate post-war reconciliation, a cleaving of popular sympathy away from complicity and toward an image of a tragic, honorable officer. Yet scholars in later decades have interrogated that neat story. Some historians emphasize Rommel's complicity through silence and benefit. He accepted awards, he commanded forces that served the war effort, and he did not publicly denounce the regime's crimes. Others insist that his actions, private warnings, calls for negotiation, and his unwillingness to obey certain orders mark him as someone whose loyalties had shifted away from Hitler. The debate turns on two distinct questions: what Rommel knew, and how he acted on what he knew. On the first point, it is clear that field commanders could not have been entirely ignorant of mass violence enacted in occupied territories and on the Eastern Front. Reports, rumors, and the presence of SS units made the reality hard to miss. On the second point, Rommel's responses were mixed. He did not become an outspoken opponent of genocide. He did not resign his commission to publicly repudiate Nazi policy. At the same time, he increasingly advocated for measures he believed would limit calamity for Germany, an argument that some interpret as moral urgency and others as self-preserving pragmatism. Both readings are historically defensible, and both are incomplete if taken as the whole story. Even the charge of betrayal can be read in more than one direction. To the regime, Rommel's growing candor was a kind of betrayal. A decorated marshal who advised negotiation and skepticism about Hitler's absolute rule had abandoned political orthodoxy. To those who saw Rommel as a militarily competent officer who sought to minimize bloodshed, the regime's treatment of him, offering death rather than due process, repackaging his funeral for propaganda purposes, was the real betrayal, the state cannibalizing its own myth to secure political continuity. The phrase in the title, "The Untold Story of Rommel's Betrayal," points to that moral paradox. The man who had been made into an icon was unmade, not simply by battlefield reverses, but by a political system that prioritized ideological purity in survival over the life of one of its most useful symbols. The historical residue of that twist shaped memory for decades. In the early Federal Republic, Rommel's reputation helped Germans draw a line between clean professional soldiers and the criminality of the SS and Nazi leadership. His image, imposing visor, determined gaze, became a figure around which narratives of honor and suffering were arranged. Internationally, Allied memorists and popular histories often depicted him as a rare German professional who respected the rules of warfare.
Yet those sympathetic takes risked obscuring broader truths: the Wehrmacht's institutional role, the complexity of individual responsibility, and the extent to which the veneer of military professionalism could coexist with, and even indirectly enable, a criminal regime. Recent scholarship complicates both polemics. Some historians emphasize Rommel's tactical brilliance while insisting on moral ambivalence. He was a soldier who excelled within a criminal state, whose choices sometimes mitigated suffering and sometimes served the machinery of war. Others delve into archival material, interrogation records, staff documents, and intercepted communications to map the gray zones of complicity and dissent. The consensus is modest. Rommel was neither saint nor straightforward villain. He was a complex actor whose decisions must be weighed against the context of a collapsing state, the pressures of command, and the severe constraints on dissent in an increasingly police-dominated society. If we step back from moral verdicts to ask a different question, why did the regime dispose of him as it did? The answer centers on political calculation. By October 1944, Hitler and his circle faced an atmosphere of existential threat and paranoia. Any figure who might serve as a symbol around which opposition could rally was potentially dangerous. Rommel, with his fame, his contacts, and his private criticisms, fit that category. Removing him quietly, repackaging his death as a patriotic sacrifice, and offering the public a sanitized image of loyalty served two functions. It eliminated a potential focal point for dissent, and it allowed propaganda to claim continuity of honor while quashing inconvenient truth. That act, state-managed, calculated, and brutal, exemplifies the betrayal, not only of Rommel as an individual, but of the moral pretenses the regime had long advertised. The legacy of this sequence, the rise, the doubts, the injury, the conspiracy allegations, and the coerced death, continues to animate debates about war, leadership, and historical memory. For some, Rommel remains a tragic figure,
a brilliant commander who, belatedly, recognized the moral abyss into which his country had plunged, and who thereby paid with his life. For others, he is a cautionary emblem, a reminder that tactical brilliance cannot be separated from the political context that enables it, and that silence in the face of atrocity carries its own weight. To weigh these judgments is to confront uncomfortable ambiguities. There are moments when individual courage stands out, acts of pastoral kindness to subordinates, efforts to limit needless suffering, and moments when institutional complicity dulls the moral glow of battlefield valor.
The historian's task is not to crown or damn, but to hold those tensions in view, to show the documents, to cite the eyewitnesses, to mark where claims are contested, and to refuse simplistic narratives that flatten complexity in the service of tidy moral lessons. When the dust of the war settled and the immediate political imperatives faded, the story of Erwin Rommel assumed a different kind of importance. It became a test case for questions we still ask about public figures who operate inside criminal or authoritarian systems. How much moral credit is due to those who push back quietly? How much blame attaches to those who cooperate without openly denouncing atrocities? Can a professional officer's attempt to limit destruction ever be disentangled from the larger enterprise he serves? Rommel's life and death refuse easy answers. They compel us to consider that loyalty can be weaponized by regimes, that public honor can be a trap, and that the price of speaking truth to power can be personal ruin. So where does the betrayal of the title land? It lands in two overlapping truths. First, Rommel was betrayed by a state that had once used him. Its propaganda made him a symbol, its leaders extracted value from his fame, and when his counsel diverged from political necessity, they chose to silence him rather than engage. Second, there is the more ambiguous sense in which Rommel betrayed certain expectations, those of moral leadership, by not breaking decisively with a regime that was committing mass crimes. Both betrayals exist side by side, the personal political betrayal enacted by Nazi leaders, and the ethical questions that arise when a military professional does not or cannot act more forcefully against wrongdoing. Historians and citizens alike will keep arguing over the balance of those two betrayals. The evidence we have, operational reports, intercepted messages, family recollections, and the surviving fragments of political correspondence, allows careful reconstruction but not complete closure. Some sources point towards complicity by omission, others underline the very real restraints and dangers of overt resistance inside a police state. Both readings help us understand the tragic mixture of honor, pragmatism, and peril that marked Rommel's final years. In the end, the story that began with a young officer in the trenches and ran through blitzkrieg, desert warfare, and coastal fortification ends with an image both haunting and instructive. A celebrated marshal, once the face of a martial myth, lying dead by his own hand after being presented with an impossible offer, an honor that was in truth a cloak for final erasure. The state that once lifted him up had discarded him to protect itself. That is the central twist. The man made into a symbol was betrayed by the symbol makers. What does that mean for us now? It means that heroic myth-making and political survival are often joined at the hip, and that individuals who rise within authoritarian systems may find themselves honored and discarded in equal measure. It means we must look hard at sources, distinguish between documented fact and contested testimony, and resist simplistic judgments. And it means remembering the human dimension, families who bore the personal cost, soldiers who fought under orders, and a nation that lived through engulfing violence. If Rommel's story teaches one sobering lesson, it is that the line between duty and complicity can be thin, and that the consequences of that ambiguity are sometimes fatal. He remains a complex figure, talented, pragmatic, occasionally humane, sometimes silent in the face of crimes, a soldier whose tactical genius could not redeem the political context in which he operated. The betrayal was both theatrical and mundane, an orchestrated removal that neutralized a potential rival, and a moral failing that adolescence of power tends to feed upon. Now it's your turn to weigh in. Was Erwin Rommel a tragic hero betrayed by a criminal regime, a complicit officer whose silence aided a monstrous project, or a more complex mixture of both? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and if you want the source documents, key memoirs, and recent scholarly essays that informed this account, check the description for a reading list and archival references. Wherever one stands, Rommel's fate remains a powerful reminder. Military skill and public adulation can be no shield against political machinery, and the true test of leadership in dark times is often not battlefield audacity, but the courage to confront evil, even when that confrontation costs everything.